And with one entry in the Onimusha series under our belt, we move on to less mapped territory, at least for me. Back when Onimusha 2 Samurai's Destiny hit the market, I rented it once and remembered not liking it too much. I put maybe half an hour or so into it and decided it just wasn't for me. So imagine my surprise when I recently popped it in my PS2 to get some footage and ended up having a blast with it. More than anything, I think this little revelation is what led me to starting this retrospective, and with that being said, let's not waste any more time and jump right in. Minasan, Onimusha Retrospective e yokozo.
When you said daughter, you didn't mean baby daughter, did you?
The sequel to Onimusha Warlords hit the scene a surprisingly short time after its predecessor did, and for good reason. It turns out both the first and second games were being worked on side by side, which was an odd move, but only gets more odd when I found out that this was always going to be the case, even back when the series was going to be released on the PS1. I guess Capcom was pretty sure the series was going to make a real impact, and I'm glad they were right, even if it was a full generation later. Interestingly, Part 2 was developed by a totally different team than the first game, which probably explains why I found it so radically different feeling when I first played it. Of course, the guys at Capcom weren't going to let a proven concept go to waste, so they got to work on finding a real-life person to base their main character on, and settled with Yusaku Matsuda, a famed actor who died more than a decade before development on the game had even started. So as you can see, just about every little factoid you could dig up on Onimusha 2's development is weird as all hell. But that being said, this is all the info I could find, so what do you say we dive into the game's story?
Look at me. Do you like what you see?
Onimusha 2's story takes place not long after the end of the first game. It seems like Nobunaga has made his return and is in the process of unifying Japan under his Genma collaborators. While on the warpath, Nobunaga decides to take out anyone who could conceivably stand up to his might if given the chance, so he sends out a few small groups to take down a few villages preemptively. One of those targets being Yagyu Village. Jubei Yagyu, returning home, finds the place a graveyard, and in pursuit of the group that's responsible, he runs into an Oni who clues him into what Nobunaga is planning and drops a bomb on him in the form of her being his mother. And now, with the blessing of the Oni, Jubei essentially continues Samanosuke's hard work. On his travels, he comes across a pretty large cast of fellow warriors and through a gift-giving system can influence the story to a pretty impressive degree.
Magoichi, where did you take my girl? How dare you disturb our time? Together!
You can play through several different story arcs, see cool after-credit scenes, and even inspire some of these guys to betray you based on how you treat them. This system gives you a lot of options on how you want your story to go, but for some reason I keep going the OU route. I guess I'm just a sucker for a good-looking girl and a nice set of armor. And it is a damn good thing we have access to these side stories because this would be a pretty bare-bones affair otherwise. Jubei's story sees him seeking revenge for his slain friends and family, and then getting that revenge. Honestly, that's about the gist of it. That being said, it's not like this is a radical departure from the first game though. It too had a pretty simple premise and not much else going on in its favor, and just like the first game, I think the story here more exists to make sure the player doesn't get bored of stabbing demon lizards over and over again.
Your eyes reveal that you are thrilled to encounter a man who is stronger than you. Whatever.
And in that sense, I think it does a good job. This is nowhere near a novel's worth of exposition, but it does set the stage for everything that needs to happen and creates a semi-believable world for all these events to take place in. Plus, I just really enjoy the predictable but still entertaining love story that forms between Jubei and OU. Just like last time, I don't think anyone looking for a deep and involving story will find themselves satiated with Onimusha 2, but that doesn't mean what is here is lacking in quality. I mean, sure, there is a scene where a mechanical horse comes to life and flies our protagonist to safety, but trust me when I say it gets way dumber than that. Overall, this one has a way more wacky type of feeling compared to the first, but to be honest, it sort of feels like a Japanese TV show with its lighthearted tone and its insistence on making humor a common element. In my opinion, that's actually a really cool direction to take a game in, but it does have the side effect of making this game feel more like a side story than a continuation of what Part 1 did, which isn't terrible in and of itself. More than anything, at least up to this point, Onimusha had done what Final Fantasy did before it. Instead of creating a specific narrative that every title would have to follow, it created a general game world in which certain elements could be expected. Onimusha 1 set up the ancient Japanese setting and demon world stuff that could translate into any other story if it needs to. I think this might have been a determining factor in me not enjoying the game my first time around, but this time I find myself appreciating it a lot more. Plus, if you're not really into the traditional Onimusha stuff, there's always side characters and their stories to focus on. After having spent so much time with Oni 2 now, I can say that I still understand why I didn't like it all those years ago, but for whatever reason this time around, those same elements are what make me enjoy it. In my defense though, I have never once on this channel claimed to be consistent or even a good source of information, so really when you think about it, this one's on you.
You will die.
The route they went with gameplay here is exactly what I like to see in a sequel. Everything you enjoyed about the last game, only cleaned up a bit with a few extras thrown in for good measure. For those of you who are familiar with Genma Onimusha on the Xbox, just imagine all the additions made there. Holding R1 still squares you off with a foe, and movement is still butter smooth. On top of all that mobility are directional modifiers for your sword swings and the charge attack that was introduced in the aforementioned Xbox port of the last game. The only difference being you no longer have to hold down the attack button to charge. Now you take advantage of the often unused variable pressure sensitive buttons and official PS2 controllers, meaning you can hold down R1 and use normal attacks, but pressing down a little harder will charge your sword. To be honest, I think I might prefer having to actually charge the attack button though. Sometimes I found myself charging an attack when I didn't want to, and I never got to a point where I could reliably stop myself from squeezing the button a little too hard in a tense fight. As you might expect, the magic attacks have made a comeback, and really there's nothing new going on there. On the other hand, the purple souls from Genma Onimusha are back, only this time they don't also power up your enemies, so call that a massive fucking improvement. Continuing in the realm of improvements, I don't think anyone's gonna miss having to level up both their weapon level and magic attacks individually, and overall combat just feels much snappier this time around. I can't necessarily quantify it, but it just feels like the pace of normal encounters is slightly faster, leading to it feeling a little more fun and challenging. Just like the first game, I'd say the first third of Samurai's Destiny is a cakewalk through Baby Town, but unlike the last release, this one really hammers on the difficulty towards the end. I sort of thought I was being a little anal with the large number of healing items I had hoarded before the last fight, but I'll be damned if I didn't use nearly every single one of them by the time I saw the end credits, which is more satisfying than it sounds, trust me. I think anyone who was able to wrap their heads around the combat in the first Onimusha will have no issues jumping right in with the sequel. They did a great job of just improving on what the last game accomplished, instead of trying to reinvent the series like Capcom is so fond of doing nowadays, and will eventually do to this series. But that's a story for a few videos in the future. Continuing on, the Ys encounters that were so satisfying to pull off are back, and call me crazy, but I think they're a little harder to do this time around. Maybe the frames in which they can be performed haven't changed, but enemy attacks are a little less telegraphed, or at least it seems that way to me. Totally contradicting what I just said, these roly-poly guys are able to be countered while they're doing their little spin attacks, which I don't think was possible in the first game, so if you do come across a room full of them, well, you just found yourself a good spot to grind red souls. On the negative end of things, purple souls don't work quite as well as they used to. This time you don't store a full stock and activate invincibility on a button press, but that mode comes into play as soon as you absorb the last purple soul. So eventually I found myself getting all but one of the purple souls I need and then avoiding them like the plague and hoping a boss would spawn one so I could use it more efficiently. Speaking of bosses, they can now be Ys encountered, which was something I would have loved to have seen in the first game, and to be honest, that's about all you can really say about the combat. More than anything, it's just all the stuff that worked before, only polished up with the benefit of a test market made up of the millions of people who played the original. It's everything you could have hoped to see in an Onimusha sequel, plus a little more, and we already know the first game may be one of my favorites of all time, so there's no use reprising why I think this stuff works so damn well. Instead, let's go a little deeper with the new Elements Part 2 introduced. In the first game, the layout was very recognizable to any RE fan. You've got a large residence and a roster of gross undead assholes standing between you and about 1 million locked doors and/or puzzles. Pretty elementary stuff, but it seems like Capcom wasn't interested in rehashing that approach this time around, or at least not fully. Instead of having a single large area to explore and inspect, you now have several smaller levels which can be accessed via the town that serves as a sort of hub area. Instead of progress being gated by locked doors and items that need to be collected, Onimusha 2 has you unlocking new locations right after you finish the last one. Now realistically, this isn't the wild change it sounds like. I mean, it's not open world or anything. Both methods allow the developer to fully control what a player does and what order they do it in, but I've always preferred the survival horror idea of letting me feel like I'm organically opening up this large compound through my exploration instead of following a very specific path that the devs have basically limited me to. At least that way I can sort of fool myself into believing I'm tackling this game in my own unique way and not one of about 2 separate approaches available to me. In Onimusha 2, you were always aware that the game is leading you around by the nose, and sure, that's not a horrible thing to come up against in a video game, but it doesn't exactly speak to the more immersive elements that make this specific genre so well loved. Using what is clearly an Iron Maiden album cover to travel between small survival horror feeling settings is all well and good, but it's what happens at the hub town that seems to be most people's favorite element.
Oh, I'll make good use of this.
Each side character introduced in Onimusha 2 hangs out in this gold rush town, and you can act like some kind of K-pop stan by constantly showering them with gifts and attention. And while we're on that subject, listen, I know you think you're on the cutting edge with this BTS garbage, but maybe listen to Girls' Generation before you start going off about Korean music on Twitter. For the rest of you, if I end up going missing for some reason, now you know why. Each one of these warriors has a different personality, and from that you're essentially supposed to make educated guesses on what trinkets they might get into. Once you've given enough gifts to a partner that they resonate with, you can increase an invisible sort of friendship gauge, which may have them showing up in parts of the story they may not have otherwise, and even affect the course of the story itself. Some of them can be driven against you if you give them shit they don't want over and over again, and some of them can be talked out of betraying you with the right amount of knickknacks. Now, I can totally see why this would appeal to some people, but I'm gonna be upfront, for some reason I just never jived with the mechanic. I don't know why, but it always felt so damn out of place for the genre and sort of took me out of the experience. Even now that I've warmed up to it a bit, I can still feel it making the playthrough feel more like a game than usual. Of course, I'm not a crazy person who expects to fully believe in an ancient Japanese world where samurais fight living skeletons with magical swords, but it's the suspension of disbelief that makes these types of games so cool to me. When you start throwing in very video gamey concepts like a trackable story flowchart and gift-giving mechanics, you sort of ruin that for me. That being said, for what it is, this system works perfectly well, and even though I just spent a long time explaining why I didn't like it very much, even I have to admit it adds a hell of a lot to the game's replay value. Maybe this kind of thing just doesn't speak to me, but if you find yourself feeling skeptical like I am, trust me when I say it doesn't detract from the experience, it's just not how I would prefer the game to play. I think those of you not really feeling the whole samurai dating sim thing will still really enjoy this game, and it really helps you don't ever have to engage with it if you don't want to. So I guess it comes out to about even all around. And since we find ourselves on a bit of a downward trend, let's try a little damage control on my comments regarding exploration. Like I said before, it is not as satisfying having the game teleport you to new locations to explore instead of organically discovering them yourself. But once you do find yourself navigating these smaller side areas, trust that they are chock full of all the things that made the last game so damn endearing. There are plenty of Genma to cut in half, all kinds of doors to open, either via puzzle solving, item fetching, or both. Hell, even my cherished puzzle boxes are back, only a little more challenging in my opinion. While these sections are noticeably smaller than what's on offer in the last game, they definitely went with a quality over quantity mantra. These sectioned off locations never seem to overstay their welcome, and while the game may be made up of smaller spots to explore, there's a lot more of them. So in total, everything adds up to a much longer playthrough than the first game, which you definitely won't see me complaining about. You will, however, see me complaining about the weapon variety. For reasons I'm not really aware of, none of the 4 implements of war on offer really do anything for me. They just don't control the way I would like them to, and really the hammer was the only one that felt good to wield. The only issue there being it mostly deals out hard knockdowns, which can be followed up by another floor slam, which will finish most enemies. An efficient way to make sure you don't take a lot of needless damage in a fight for sure, but not exactly a mechanically engaging combat situation. Just constant hits of forward and square till the room's empty. And with that complaint, you might wonder why the hell I said combat feels so much better overall in this one. Well, I think that's more about Jubei's movement speed feeling a little more snappy. Really, what I'm trying to say is that this game's combat is so fun that not even a big letdown is enough to ruin it. If you had fun with what Onimusha Warlords did, a lot of these additions and alterations might be a little scary, but trust me when I say this game still burns bright with that same creative fire that made the last one so damn enjoyable. It may look very different on the surface, but deep down it's the same exact awesome gameplay, just served up in a slightly different way. Onimusha 2 Samurai's Destiny is an amazingly fun time, and I'm really glad I gave it the old second chance recently, because I have no issues admitting I was dead wrong for not getting into it before. If you find yourself in my camp where you're not really sure it'll give that same Onimusha feeling, I'd recommend trying it out anyways. The changes it made are a bit massive in scope, but even when they fail for me, they still end up supporting a really fun game. This may not be the sequel I would have developed if given some kind of godlike control over the chaos that is Capcom's video game output, but it's still one that I'm glad to have in the series.
Hey you! Come out!
Look at me, Jubei. Oh. Am I pretty?
Onimusha 2 is one of those games that looks way better than its predecessor, but in such subtle ways that most people probably wouldn't even notice. After all, it's the same 3D models over 2D backgrounds that the original had, but if you were a terribly boring person lacking social skills, like myself, you probably would have already noticed that there's a lot more complicated stuff going on here. First off, there are plenty of scenes that are filled with all kinds of impressive animations, both in the 3D and 2D assets. For example, the beginning section takes place during a storm, making for one damn impressive display. Aside from that, you'll see all kinds of animated elements in the 2D backgrounds, and while this was something you would see in Part 1, I'd say these animations are more numerous and complicated here. However, I think the most glaring improvements have been in the faces. Now don't get me wrong, Takeshi Kaneshito's likeness was well adapted in Onimusha 1, but it lacked a little bit of depth and detail looking at it after playing this one. Faces all around are well animated here and seem to strike a really pleasing balance between realistic and cartoony, which has always been my sort of comfort zone. Just like literally every single Onimusha title on the PS2, Samurai's Destiny does not allow for progressive scan output, which means we're left with a de-interlaced picture provided by the Tink 5X. And if there was any advertisement for how great old games can look on real hardware, I think it's seeing a PS2 game running at 1440p. The interlaced nature of the picture lends itself to a bit of aliasing, which can be a turnoff for some, but I just can't help but fall in love with this overly sharp look for early 2000s 3D graphics. On an interesting note, I often use OPL and an internal mechanical hard drive to play my PS2 games and capture footage for the channel, since my DVD drive isn't exactly the healthiest, which is exactly how I went about playing Onimusha 2 at first. Well, I had gotten through a good chunk of the game and noticed that scene changes were often accompanied by massive frame drops. At first I kind of thought this was just a necessary downside of such a big jump up in visuals, or maybe even something caused by the adaptive deinterlacing the Tink 5X offers, but I found the same slowdown using the OSSC and FrameMeister. I mean, I've used this same internal hard drive for countless games and I've never come across any problems like this. Well, lo and behold, the issue is not present while playing on an actual disc. I guess there goes a few hours I'll just never get back. So if you find yourself a real disc of Onimusha, expect a game that looks exactly like the first one, but better. Something that probably shouldn't be a novel occurrence in sequels, but here we are.
You are not worthy.
Listen guys, you know I am always down to rant and rave for hours on end here, but I genuinely couldn't find much to talk about. I mean, yes, Onimusha 2 was much more of a game than the first entry, and even though I don't necessarily enjoy all of them, the devs made all kinds of additions. It seems like there should be so much more to say here, but honestly, I feel like the issue is, Onimusha 2 is just Onimusha 1, but more. Unless I repeat everything I said in the last video, it looks like this one's going to be a little shorter than I would normally like. Hell, the game doesn't even have any ports, leaving me struggling to find something to talk about. And again, I don't want that to come across as some kind of a diss. I had an absolute blast with this game and even found myself totally changing my mind on it. I just couldn't find a whole lot of other ways to say that. For me, this is a supreme recommendation, especially if you enjoyed the first game. While there's enough changes here to justify calling it a spin-off, I think it still stays true to the heart of what made the last entry great, and a little departure that still manages to stick close to a recognizable experience is something that's definitely worth praising, especially with the knowledge that we'll see that traditional Onimusha feel come right back again soon. But before you mess around with Onimusha 3, there might be something else to check out. Something a little more 2D. Well, until then, I hope you guys had fun, and fingers crossed I get to see you next time. So until then, minasan, arigatou gozaimashita. Hello, you absolute sex symbols. Thanks for sticking around for this one. I know it isn't the rambling hour-long epic you might be used to, but there's a value in quality over quantity, right? Well, regardless, if you liked what you saw here today, make sure to check the screen for some other videos that'll get your almonds activated. And once again, a massive thanks to Artini for today's thumbnail. His art is absolutely killer, and he's trying to get a YouTube channel going. I think a lot of you guys can sympathize with that struggle, so if you get into that kind of stuff, I'd appreciate you checking him out. Well, I think that's it, so peace out, and I'll see all of you next time.